Samuel Garrett saw the wagon when it was still a mile out, a dark shape crawling through the amber dust of late September. He stood at his fence line with his hand on the post he'd sunk himself 15 years back, watching the way a man watches a storm approach, knowing it will arrive, knowing there's no shelter that will hold. The Montana sky stretched endless above his 640 acres, that peculiar gold that comes just before autumn turns its back on mercy. His cattle grazed beyond the near pasture, dark shapes against darker hills. Everything he'd built, everything he'd earned alone. The wagon stopped 20 feet from where he stood. Dust settled around it like a question he didn't want answered. She descended slowly, one hand gripping the sideboard for balance. And even after 30 years he knew her. Not by her face, that had been worn down by time and distance into something he barely recognized, but by the way she held her shoulders back despite obvious exhaustion. Constance Garrett, his mother, a woman who'd stopped having claim to that title the day she walked out of his life. She wore what had once been a fine traveling dress, now shabby at the seams. In her right hand she carried a battered leather suitcase, brown with brass corners, held like it contained something more precious than clothing. It looked heavy. She looked small. Samuel. Her voice hadn't changed. That was somehow worse than if it had. He didn't move from the fence. She stopped, seemed to gather herself. I've come a long way. I need shelter, just for a few days. The wind pushed at them both. He felt the fence post solid under his palm, the wood he'd chosen and placed and trusted to hold. His jaw tightened until his back teeth ached. You left, he said. You made that choice 30 years ago. I'm making mine tonight. He paid the driver from the folded bills in his shirt pocket. 12 miles to Copper Falls. The boarding house would take her. He watched the wagon turn, watched her sit rigid in the back, the suitcase clutched against her chest. Watched until the darkness swallowed them both and even the sound of wheels faded into nothing. Then Samuel Garrett walked back to his empty house and sat alone with what he'd done. Dawn found Samuel in the breaking pen with a 3-year-old gelding that had more fight than sense. He worked the horse hard, harder than necessary, his movements sharp where they should have been patient. Sweat soaked through his shirt despite the morning chill. His shoulders burned. Good. He wanted them to. The gelding finally settled, sides heaving, and Samuel led it to water with hands that wouldn't quite steady. 30 years he'd worked this land. 30 years since he'd been a boy of 14 watching his mother climb into Edmund Fairchild's carriage, a carpetbag in her hands and not a single backward glance for her husband or son. He was saddling his mare for the fence line when he saw it. His father's old saddle hanging in the barn's shadows, leather cracked but still sound. Samuel's hands stilled on the cinch. He remembered his father coughing through that last winter, lungs filling with fluid while 14-year-old Samuel learned to set snares and stretch every coin. Remembered being 16 and digging frozen ground alone because there was no one else to bury the man who'd taught him that integrity mattered more than comfort. His mother had sent letters. He'd burned them unopened. By noon, Samuel needed supplies he didn't want and company he'd tolerate even less. Copper Falls sat 12 miles east, a collection of weathered buildings clinging to the promise of the railroad that had come through 5 years back. He tied his mare outside Brennan's general store and felt eyes on him before he reached the door. Mr. Garrett. Thomas Brennan's voice carried too much careful courtesy. Hey, your mother took a room at Mrs. Holloway's place. Samuel selected nails, paid in silence. Lot of folks saying, Brennan tried again. Lot of folks should mind what's theirs. Samuel's voice came out flat and final. On the street, he caught fragments of conversation that stopped when he passed. Mrs. Cooper from the Presbyterian Church looked at him with something between pity and condemnation. Old Jim Crawford nodded once, understanding in his weathered face. Crawford's own son had left for California and never written. But the younger ones, the ones who still believed in tidy redemption, they watched Samuel like he'd committed some unforgivable sin. Let them watch. They hadn't been there. The ride home stretched longer than it should have. Samuel found himself taking the route past the oak tree where his mother used to hang laundry, found himself checking the kitchen windowsill where she'd kept herbs in clay pots. Nothing remained. When she left, she'd erased herself so completely it was as if she'd never existed at all. which was exactly what Samuel had spent 30 years trying to believe. He stood in the empty house as shadows lengthened across floorboards he planed himself, and thought, 30 years she had to come back. Why now? What does she want from me that she couldn't take before? The silence gave him no answer. 3 days after he'd turned her away, Dr. Morton came riding up through Samuel's north pasture with the determined gait of a man on a mission he didn't want but wouldn't shirk. Samuel saw him from the barn and felt something cold settle in his chest before the doctor even dismounted. "She's got pneumonia," Morton said without preamble. He was 63, had delivered Samuel into this world and set his father's broken arm the winter before he died. His face carried the weight of both memories. "Bad. Mrs. Holloway's doing what she can, but your mother's asking for you." Samuel's hands tightened on the bridle he'd been mending. "Then she'll be disappointed." "She's dying, Samuel." Morton's voice went hard. "Whatever happened between you, whatever she did, she's still your mother. And she's alone. She made that choice. So did you, 3 nights ago." The doctor's jaw worked. "I knew your father. He was a good man. He gestured at nothing, at everything. This isn't what he'd want from you." Samuel felt the words like a blow, but his face stayed stone. "My father died calling her name. She didn't come then either." Morton left, and the silence that followed felt like judgment. The Cattle Association met Thursday evenings in the Presbyterian church basement. Samuel went because his herd mattered more than his comfort, but he felt the shift in the room the moment he walked in. Minister Aldridge, 40 years old and still believing the world worked like Scripture promised, called the meeting to order, then spent 5 minutes talking about Christian charity and familial duty without once saying Samuel's name. He didn't need to. Every eye found Samuel anyway. "Sometimes," Aldridge said, his earnest face flushed with righteous conviction, "we're given chances to make things right, to show grace we didn't receive, to be better than we were wronged." Half the room nodded. The other half, ranchers who knew what it meant to survive hard years alone, kept their counsel. But Samuel felt the division like a crack running through foundation stone. Mrs. Holloway caught him on the church steps afterward. She was a widow herself, understood loss, but her eyes held something close to anger. "She calls your name in her sleep," Mrs. Holloway said quietly. "Apologizes to someone who isn't there. And that suitcase," she shook her head. "She won't let it go. Not even in fever. Keeps the key on a chain around her neck. Says she has to make it right before it's too late. That's not my concern. Isn't it?" Mrs. Holloway's voice dropped. "Your father was a good man, Samuel Garrett, but he's gone. She's here, and you're choosing this." He rode home under a sky gone heavy with the season's first real storm. The temperature was dropping. First frost would come soon, and then the long Montana winter that didn't forgive weakness or hesitation. Inside his house, solid walls he'd raised himself, floors he'd planed, windows he'd fitted, Samuel stood at the stove and felt anything but safe. The town's judgment pressed against him like the weather. Their expectations, their certainty about what he owed. He compromised with himself in the darkness. He'd pay her medical expenses, every cent Morton asked for, but he wouldn't visit. Wouldn't sit beside her bed and pretend 30 years dissolve in the face of pneumonia and regret. Why should her suffering move me when mine never moved her? But alone in the night, with thunder starting to roll across his land, Samuel remembered something else. His father's final words, spoken through fluid-filled lungs. "Don't let bitterness make you cruel, boy. Don't let what she did turn you into something hard and cold." Samuel had thought he'd honored that. Built a life. Stayed honest. Worked hard. Now he wasn't sure what he'd become. The storm broke just after midnight, and he didn't sleep. Samuel arrived at the boarding house before dawn, when Copperfall still slept and no one could witness his surrender. The sky hung gray and uncertain, caught between night and morning. Mrs. Holloway met him at the door, said nothing, just pointed him up the narrow stairs. The room smelled of camphor and sickness and something older, the particular staleness of air that hasn't moved in days. Constance sat propped against thin pillows, her face pale as winter sky but her eyes clear. The suitcase sat on the floor beside her bed, within arm's reach. Her hand rested near it unconsciously, the way a soldier sleeps with his rifle close. She didn't plead when she saw him. That disarmed him more than tears would have. "I'm not here for reconciliation," Samuel said, standing in the doorway. "Dr. Morton says you're dying. I'll pay the expenses. But don't mistake duty for forgiveness. I'm not asking for forgiveness." Her voice came thin but steady. "I'm asking you to understand what you've hated me for all these years." Samuel's jaw tightened. "You left. You chose a railroad investor's money over your family. What's to understand? Edmund Fairchild didn't give me a choice." She drew a careful breath, each word costing her. "He wanted me, and when I refused, he threatened to foreclose on your father's land. The bank note, Fairchild owned the bank. He said he'd destroy everything unless I came with him." The floor seemed to shift beneath Samuel's boots. "You're lying." "I wish I were." Something in her face, not quite a smile, too bitter for that. "Your father was proud. Good. Honest. If I'd told him, he would have fought, and Fairchild would have crushed him. So I made a bargain. My life for yours. Why didn't you tell us?" The words tore out of Samuel like something bleeding. "Why let us think you just? Would you have let me go if you'd known?" Constance met his eyes without flinching. "Would your father have stood by while I sacrificed myself?" "He would have fought, Samuel, and we would have lost everything. The land, the house, maybe more. Fairchild collected beautiful things. Women, power. He didn't care what he broke to get them." Samuel's hands were fists at his sides. 30 years of certainty cracking like ice in spring. "You could have. There must have been." "There wasn't." She touched the suitcase, that unconscious gesture again. "I stopped being your mother the day I became his possession. But I never stopped loving you. That's why I left. To keep you safe. To give you a chance." The silence stretched between them, full of things neither knew how to say. Outside, Copper Falls was waking, roosters, wagon wheels, the ordinary sounds of morning that felt impossibly distant. "Everything I kept is in there," Constance said softly, nodding toward the suitcase. "Everything Fairchild couldn't take. I came to explain before I died. To give you what truth I could. I don't expect forgiveness. But I needed you to know, my choice wasn't abandonment. It was love." Samuel stood there, a man built on the foundation of abandonment, suddenly learning the ground beneath him had always been different than he thought. The anger didn't disappear. 30 years of it couldn't dissolve in one conversation. But it shifted, made room for something more complicated. Something that hurt worse because it demanded he reconsider everything. He left without touching her, without promises, without forgiveness spoken aloud. But he didn't refuse to return. And that, for now, was all the truth either of them could bear. Constance died on a Tuesday morning while Samuel was saddling his horse to visit her. Mrs. Holloway met him at the boarding house door with the news, and he stood there holding his hat, understanding that some reconciliations come too late no matter how fast you ride toward them. The funeral was Friday. Samuel sat in the front pew of the Presbyterian church while whispers moved through the sparse congregation like wind through dry grass. Dr. Morton sat to his left, Mrs. Holloway to his right, silent witnesses, anchors against judgment. Minister Aldridge spoke of grace and mystery, of paths only God could see clearly. Samuel barely heard him. When they carried the coffin out, Samuel was one of the pallbearers. His hands on the pine wood his mother would rest in forever. At the graveside, with the first snow beginning to fall in small, deliberate flakes, he reached into his pocket and withdrew his father's wedding ring, a gold band worn smooth by years of work, the last possession Samuel had kept of the man who'd taught him everything except how to forgive. He placed it on the coffin without words. Let it be buried with her, these two who'd loved each other before Fairchild's greed tore them apart. Some in the crowd saw it as weakness. Others saw what it was, the hardest grace Samuel knew how to give. Mrs. Holloway pressed the suitcase into his hands afterward, along with a sealed letter bearing a San Francisco law firm's return address. She said you'd know what to do with it, the widow told him, and there was gentleness in her weathered face. Back at the ranch, Samuel set the suitcase on his kitchen table. She'd left no key. He had to break the lock with a chisel, had to force it open, and he understood that was intentional. She wanted him to choose to know, to want it enough to break through. Inside, letters, hundreds of them, organized by year and tied with faded ribbon. Letters she'd written to him every month for 30 years and never sent. He opened one at random, dated when he would have been 23. I heard from Mr. Brennan that you've added 80 acres to the ranch. Your father would be so proud. I am proud, though I have no right to be. You've become the man he always knew you'd become. Photographs, too. Samuel at various ages, captured by investigators she must have hired. Watching him from a distance she couldn't cross. Building a life she couldn't share. Property deeds for San Francisco real estate. Stock certificates. Her diary, leather-bound and full of careful script documenting years of captivity disguised as comfort. The lawyer's letter explained what the documents couldn't. Fairchild had died 5 years ago, leaving everything to the woman he'd imprisoned with wealth. Constance had been free to return, free to reclaim her life. But she'd waited, believing Samuel would refuse her money, refuse anything that came from Fairchild's shadow. I don't ask for forgiveness, she'd written in her final instructions to the lawyer. I ask that you live freely with what I leave you. The money can't give you back what I took, but perhaps it can give you what you've denied yourself. A life that isn't defined by my absence. Samuel sat at his table as snow fell outside and darkness gathered. He held 30 years of love in his hands. Imperfect, complicated, but real. The fortune she'd left him wasn't the deeds or the stocks. It was the proof that she'd never forgotten, never stopped being his mother, even when she couldn't be anything else. He'd lost 30 years, gained the truth too late for it to change anything except everything. Outside, the first real snow of winter covered his land in white silence, erasing tracks, making the world knew whether he was ready or not. Spring came to Montana the way it always did, reluctant, grudging, but inevitable. 6 months after he'd buried his mother beside his father, Samuel Garrett stood in melting snow and watched green push through frozen ground with something close to wonder. He wasn't alone anymore. Tommy worked beside him, a 17-year-old orphan from Copper Falls with quiet hands and a willingness to learn. Samuel had hired him in February, surprising himself with the offer. The boy reminded him of someone, a younger version of himself, maybe, or the son he'd never let himself imagine having. The house had changed too. Samuel was framing an addition, 2 extra bedrooms, a larger kitchen. Space for whom, he couldn't say. But the possibility no longer felt like betrayal. The money from Fairchild's estate had bought him freedom from constant survival, given him room to choose connection over mere endurance. On Sunday, Samuel rode to the cemetery on the hill above town. He brought wildflowers, nothing fancy, just what grew naturally in the meadow where his cattle grazed. He placed them on both graves and spoke aloud, the way he'd started doing months ago when talking to the dead felt less lonely than silence. Thank you, he said simply, to the woman who'd sacrificed everything, to the man who'd taught him integrity, to both of them for the complicated legacy they'd left him. He'd brought something else, a young apple tree, roots wrapped in burlap. He planted it between their graves, digging deep into earth still cold from winter. It would take years to bear fruit. He might not live to taste it, but someone would. Tommy, maybe, or whoever came after. Samuel's hands worked the soil, pressing roots into place, covering them with earth and care. The spring sun warmed his back. The graves sat quiet behind him, and the future stretched ahead, uncertain, yes, but no longer frightening. She'd given him 30 years of rage to keep him strong. Now her truth gave him permission to be soft. Both were love, in their way. Both had shaped him into someone who could finally understand the difference between the stories we tell ourselves and the harder truths beneath. He stood, brushed dirt from his hands, and looked at what he'd planted. Not an ending, a beginning. The kind that grows slowly, bears fruit you might never see, but matters anyway.